Hello and welcome to CII's webinar, Construction Readiness Assessment Tool. We appreciate you taking the time to join us. This webinar focuses on one of our newer tools that helps you ensure you're ready to start construction, and it can be used in restarting projects that have been suspended or significantly slowed down due to any reason, but specifically due to COVID-19 and the reactions to it. This is a topic you asked for, and we want you to know that we're listening to you. Some general information. This webinar is being recorded, so we'll keep everybody on mute. The material will be available on our blog page, which is www.construction-institute.org/blog. On your control panel, you'll see a section called Questions. Please feel free to enter your questions there, and we'll address them at the end of the webinar. Please let us know when you ask a question. Please let us know what company you work for, or at least whether you're an owner or a contractor or a service provider, so we have the perspective of your question. I'm Mike Pappas, CII's Associate Director for Deployment. With us today, we have Steve Cabano and Jimmy Cravens from Pathfinder. Pathfinder has been a CII member for 14 years and is a capital project management consulting firm headquartered in New Jersey with additional offices in Houston and Calgary. They have worked with more than half of the CII member organizations in supporting projects through direct project consultation, team augmentation, and training. Okay, Steve, tell us about this tool and how you've been using it with project restarts.
Thanks, Mike, and welcome everyone. I'll start today just by going over the agenda, and we'll try to keep on pace as much as possible. A little bit more on introductions, but I would like to spend a little bit of time on industry perspective, which is, what's happening today versus kind of traditional, project environments, and obviously the COVID-19 has a lot to do with that. We'll take a little bit of time just as a refresher of the construction readiness assessment tool. Jimmy will give us some background, being that he sat on the team that developed that several years ago. And then we'll dive into the restart environment, and we'll talk about that in a generic basis of any project that's going through a shutdown or a slowdown, and then kind of planning for its restart. And then we'll kind of peel the layer of the onion a little bit more and say, okay, now what's specific about COVID-19 and the issues that we're going to be facing here in the next 6 to 12 months or plus. And hopefully we'll leave enough time for some Q&A at the end. So again, myself and Jimmy will be presenting from a Pathfinder standpoint. Mike will come back and join us in the Q&A as we progress through this. So let me take a little bit of time and talk about kind of the industry as a whole. And again, you all are experiencing it as well as us. But this is it's a cyclical business. It tends to get very active at times and slow down. If you're in the oil and gas business, obviously that's generated by pricing, oil and gas pricing. If you're in other industries, it's basically related to the economy and markets, that are active or non-active, and then we execute capital accordingly across those markets. This issue today, the economy was running fairly well, and the quote unquote the black swan event of a pandemic is something that many of us, I would venture to say most of us, did not have in our risk registers. But it's just another example of kind of the swings that the industry goes through as we're planning and executing projects. If you go back and look at some of the past data on CII, whether it's McKinsey's study a couple years ago on major capital projects, IPA, Pathfinder's information, a lot of the struggle that we have on large capital projects is the duration, right? They go over a long period of time. And you're going to go through natural swings of economies and so on through the life of a mega project. But as I said before, this transition's a little different, right? This is something that is not necessarily driven by market needs or so on. It's a virus, and the pandemic that that we're all experiencing has caused this new fluctuation in our projects. So many projects are slowing down or shutting down. Some of them are planning for, say, 6-month hiatuses and then kind of come back with, rejuvenating their execution efforts. Others are looking at potentially a year, and others maybe even longer, right? So the expectation is if you had a crystal ball, when is the economy starting to come back? And it's a guess for all of us. But I think the key here is that we want to make sure that we're doing the right things for our projects during the slowdown in preparation for when we do restart these projects. So if you take a look at the session that Mike led last week on what are the CII tools that can support the conditions that we're in right now. There's a handful of CII tools that fit perfectly within the considerations that we are going through today to plan for tomorrow. That session last week had over 700 people that had signed up for it, so it was very well attended. This is the drill down into one of those tools, right? This is the construction readiness assessment tool and how it would apply to the shutdown, slow down, and then restart back up at some period of time, whether that's 6 months to a year or so on. So just as a refresher, and I apologize for those of you that are using the tool already and know it well, these are some slides from the original CRA presentation that the team did, and they used an example. It says let's basically start with a project in mind, and we're saying, okay, we're in the planning phases of an opportunity. We've got some vision of what the project's going to look like. We've got materials, equipment, labor. We've got cranes, construction activities going on, and we want to make sure that environment is as efficient and as effective as possible when we're planning to go into construction. The tool also basically started to say, okay, well, what do we have that exists today? And if we've got a site that has not been quadranted off, we don't have security fencing and so on, are we ready? Are we ready to mobilize our resources? If we got warehouses that are empty, right, that we haven't pre-ordered any equipment, materials, and so on, are we ready to hit the field? Site issues, security, fencing, those types of things. Has that been evaluated and planned for in the project? Do we have the resources available to start our construction activities? And have the team, organization charts been developed, and have we filled the organization needs? Engineering, is it full of holes, clouds, incomplete engineering? We look at the 3D model. Do we have clashes and interferences that we still have to deal with? And would that lend itself to an efficient and effective construction environment if these things still exist? And yet we still have our business folks saying, "Yep, let's get this thing underway." Right? We want to green light the project. We want to get it going. I want to see holes in the ground and steel being erected and so on. And we argue whether we're ready. And should we actually start to mobilize resources if we've got a lot of issues still in hand? So what we don't want to have happen is we get into the execution phase and we start to see things like our schedule slip, or we've got productivity issues where it's taking a lot longer and more resources and so on to do the work. Obviously, that all supports a cost overrun condition. We end up going back and doing rework because we didn't do the first phase of it efficiently and effectively enough, and obviously change orders and so on. So what we want to be able to do is to basically have I'll call it a traffic cop that says, yes, we're ready to mobilize. We have an opportunity for an efficient and effective work environment, or no, let's hold off. We're just not ready to move into that aspect of the work yet. So what CII did is they developed a project research team to basically take a look at what are those series of things that need to be in place prior to going to the field, prior to executing or entering into the construction, to make sure that we can have an efficient and effective, productive execution process and execution phase. So the team basically looked at, what are those construction readiness items? Are there any factors that may be missing that we should have in place that we don't? And basically put together kind of a best practice on what are those aspects of construction that we need to have in place to make for a efficient and effective work environment. So the team was put together. They had representatives from all these companies that were part of the research team, of which Jimmy Cravens from Pathfinder was one of them. And I'm going to hand it over to him to explain a little bit more about the research and the outcome of the research. Jimmy?
Okay, thank you, Steve. As Steve said, we had a real good cross-section of companies there. We had owners, we had contractors, we had people who worked in commercial buildings, we had people from oil and gas, power, and so a real good cross-section. Essentially, I think that if you would ask any of us before the research started, what are the factors that are associated with construction readiness, we would have answered just like a lot of you on the phone would probably answer, IFC drawings, all your permits, all your indirects, things of that nature, the things that we traditionally thought of as required for efficient and effective construction. What happened as a research group, and we just want to take a couple minutes so that everybody understands, and like Steve said, I apologize to any of you who are already familiar with the tool. This won't be a long, drawn-out discussion, but we do want everybody to understand how the tool works. So for the first several months, the research team focused on brainstorming to determine what are the factors that are required for construction readiness. As I said, some of them were obvious, but then as we dove deeper, we found that, yeah, you could make the case that a whole lot of other things were important for construction. So we ended up with 15 categories. You see in front of you here the title of those categories. You see the number of factors in each category, and then you see the last category, which is an open one, which we'll discuss in a little bit. But essentially, of the fixed categories, there's 15 categories and 228 questions that assess a project's readiness for construction. So typically, take engineering. Do you have IFC drawings? Have you done all your clash and interference checks? Do you have your standards and specifications ready for use? Do you have a process that will afford timely response to RFIs? All of these things were geared to not waiting. Let's get the RFI process documented, ready, and ready to go for when you start construction. So that's just typical of the items that were in the engineering section. Change management. Do you have a methodology for evaluation and quantification of changes? Do you have a way to communicate change orders? Do you have a way of updating and tracking change orders? Again, something I should have pointed out before, every question in the construction readiness tool is a yes/no answer. It is intentionally that way. It's not a subjective thing of 1 to 5 or anything like that. You either have these things or you don't, and if you don't, those become action items. So just a brief discussion of how the research was accomplished. We took a sampling of approximately 100, actually there were a few more than that, completed projects. We looked at a lot of aspects of those projects. We had 17 questions of general information, what size, what type, where location, all those kinds of things. We had the readiness factors, and I'll talk in a minute about how we did that. Excuse me, we had performance indicators. How did these completed projects finish up? And then we had some feedback questions about the actual tool itself to collect information for research. So we issued all of these questions to volunteers, as we always do with CII, people who are willing to help. And what they did essentially was took projects that were either complete or nearing completion, looked back at the point of construction mobilization and said, where were we? Were we ready? Were we not ready? In a retrospective look. By putting that in line with the performance indicators, we were able to tell what characteristics were always yeses for successful projects, what characteristics were always no's for unsuccessful projects, and of course, everything in between. So in doing so, we were able to weight the importance of each question that was being asked. So this whole database of completed projects became the basis for the CRA tool and its ability to assess whether you were ready or not for construction. I hope that wasn't too fast. I hope it was able to be followed. The methodology, we can obviously ask questions. So Steve, you can either start there or?
Yeah, so I mean, the results of what those model projects or those sample projects were pretty shocking, right? I think some of it would be commonplace, and we'd all understand that there'd be some movement. When we look at those projects ready for execution and not ready. But when you start to look at like productivity improvements of 29% or schedule reduction of 22%, those are huge numbers, right? I mean, when you take a look at the size of projects and the magnitude of spend, and we can save 20% potentially on making execution efficient. That doesn't mean to say that it would not have taken a little bit longer to get to this point, or we may not have spent a little bit more money to get to this point. But if we can make the execution, the construction part of this as efficient as possible, and that's where we're spending the big money, then overall the projects do results are very well. So one of the other things in line with that simplicity that Jimmy was talking about, the results wanted to be analyzed in a simplistic manner as well. So basically came up with a gauge that, through the measurement and the weightings that Jimmy was talking about, that, if you have a 0 to a 75 score, you probably got some work to do, right? You're not ready for construction. If you're in that 75 to 85 score, you're probably, you might be okay, you might need some more work. Obviously, if we're in the 85 to 100, we're probably ready for execution. So let's just real quick look at the tool itself. So again, it's just simple to use. Go in, click on project assessment. You've got these are the 15 areas, and as Jimmy was talking about, that bottom right corner is the 16th area, any additional factors, and that's going to come into play here a little bit later when we talk about restart. So any one of these, if you click on them, it's a series of questions, right? And let me just go back here, the 24 factors, the 17 factors that are identified under these major items, these are the questions that are being asked. It's addressing those factors. And if you look to the right, it's the yes, no, or not applicable type answer. So, if it's asking you for a project schedule or let's say a project resource loaded schedule, and you have a project schedule that is a CPM, but it's not resource loaded, the answer is no, right? Because you don't have all of the items required for that particular factor that's being looked at. So it's yes, no. The results of this, then you have a lot of different reports that can be issued from the tool. So one's the gauge. So in this particular project, our first review, not so good. We got a 64 score. There's some things that we need to improve on. We go to the spider diagram, excuse me, and the black line here, that is our target. That's what we're saying, that if we can hit those factors or those areas within that level, we're in good shape. The green is what this first assessment showed us. So there's a couple of areas we're doing okay, but there's quite a few areas that need improvement, right? And the power of this tool comes in the next couple of items, right? It's any of those areas that are deficient. It basically identifies what those are, and then the team basically has to fill in I'll call it a roles and responsibility chart if you want, but it's what is the action that should be taken to close that particular activity. Who's responsible to get it done? This is the racy portion of this. And then by when? When do we want and need that item completed? And again, we're going to come back to this when we talk about the restart, because we may be doing one of these early to identify kind of progress as we go through the restart overall sequence. And then if there's any additional items. So this basically creates an action list that we then manage and execute. Hopefully we get some of that done. We come back and we do another assessment, a new review, and hopefully we've moved the needle, right? And now you look at the score of a 94, pretty much we're good to go. So let's see how that looks on our spider diagram. That's now the yellow review, and you can see how we've progressed from the green to the yellow as it relates to where we wanted to be in the plan. So hopefully, that puts us in a it doesn't guarantee it, but it puts us in a good position for a successful execution, which hopefully means we'll have a good, successful project as we progress forward. Okay, so now let's take a look at, excuse me, how this applies to the restart environment. And first, we got to kind of define what this restart environment might include, right? So, the questions that are asked, those 200 plus questions that Jimmy was talking about, the factors, they still apply, right? But they apply as it relates to today's environment. So you can use the tool as it stands today, but you got to look at it through a lens of the point in time that you're analyzing the project, not when you initially started the job. So again, I'll use schedule as an example, right? I might have had a fantastic schedule put together in the initial start of the project. It was critical path, it was resource loaded, everybody signed off and bought in on it. Project's progressing, now we go into this slowdown and shutdown mode, right? Okay, we're going to start a construction readiness or restart readiness assessment. I got to take a look, and I look at that schedule and say, okay, in today's world, right, of the restart, does that schedule still hold value? And although I had a great schedule to start with, to be honest with you, it doesn't mean much now, right? We've got to take a look at it as of the snapshot of today. And again, if I have some deficiencies in that schedule, then the answer is no in the analysis. I'm not ready, right? So to answer a question of a yes, it has to be as looking through today's lens. And all of the other stuff that we had put together for this particular opportunity or this particular project may not have a lot of credence when we're looking at the restart versus the original start. So it's a snapshot of a point in time of today. Now, multiple CRAs or construction readiness assessments in this restart mode may be beneficial, where you might do one right today as you're slowing the project down to say, okay, what are all those things that I need to have when I go to restart it? And then you might want to do a progress. So again, going back to that spider diagram we saw a few slides ago, that it'll track how we're doing in progress of those 200 some odd items. The other aspect, there are, as I said, you can use the construction readiness tool as it stands, just with a different lens. But remember that bottom right area that said special factors. That's an area that you can, if you can't cover something that is related to that specific restart environment, and I'll talk about COVID-19 here in a second, but any restart environment, you might want to put it in that special factors area and draw that out specifically. Whether it might be a flood as an example, right? If we go back to several years ago in the Gulf Coast area, there may be some specific issues that you can't tie back to the 15, and you put back into that restart mode in that 16th category because of flood conditions. Okay. So here's kind of an example of what that might look like, right? So if we take a look at the original construction readiness assessment questions. What we have on the bottom would be how, if you want to go in and actually modify the questions for the restart, the specific restart, that question number 1 might end up reading, have the project goals, objectives, or drivers changed as a result of the shutdown, and have those changes been communicated? Again, if we're shutting a project down for 6 months to 12 months, and you're going through, let's say, the world economic crisis of 10, 12 years ago, yeah, the business climate may change, right? So do I still have the same drivers? Am I going to make decisions when I get into execution based on cost versus schedule, or vice versa, depending on what's the business drivers? So you might go, and we've done this for a couple of our clients, where we actually go in and modify the questions based on the restart environment. But as I said before, you can also use that 16th category to cover some of those outlier type of questions. So let's just take a look at some of the general restart questions, right? The first one we talked about already, right? Has the business case changed because of the delay in the project, or is it the delay in the project as a result of an industry change? Has that affected the drivers? Has a restart plan been defined? This is a project execution plan, but in the restart mode. So we tend to call them preps, right? Project restart execution plans. The original execution plan probably was done very well, but now we're basically starting over again, right? So we've got to have the execution strategy related to what the restart requirements are. Things like training of employees, internal employees, right? We might have to let some people go, and we're bringing some people back. Maybe our contracted resources. There's going to be a learning curve. The odds of getting everybody 100% that was on the job originally back on our job during the restart, probably pretty slim. So what kind of training and has that been taken into account for the restart? Were any equipment that was previously delivered, was it stored properly? And do I need to take any considerations in that during the restart? Construction equipment, we may have had to demobilize, and if we demobilize, has that construction equipment been put on order, and is it going to be readily available when we need it? Were any of the assumptions that we may have taken during the original start of this job, were they addressed? We have time now, right? This is where we should be really focusing on getting that execution strategy refined, finishing up any of the engineering, those types of things. Any of those issues that were kind of questionable when we first started the job, we need to take advantage of the shutdown and slow down and deal with those. Another one might be the weather window, right? We're shifting now 6 months, 12 months, maybe 18 months. Has that put us into a different weather window, and do I need to take that into consideration when I'm starting this job up? So just an example of a handful of general restart questions or issues that you might encounter. Now let's take a look at today. We just went through a series of aspects that pretty much any restart would have to deal with. There are a number, and probably more than a number, of now very questionable type questions that we've got coming up that we may not even know the answers to yet, that have to do with COVID-19 and the whole coronavirus impact. And just as an example of a couple of these, right? So now these are, if we were doing a construction restart assessment, that's one thing. But now we're in a kind of a very unique type situation. And these are the kind of questions that you have to take a look at whether you want to modify the 200 and something questions within this COVID-19, or do you want to handle these as that 16th category and deal with them specifically because they are unique. They're unique today. They may become more commonplace if we have to live within this environment for a longer period of time. But as an example, right, has a virus testing plan been established for your site? Now that could mean Just go to the next one here on temperature monitoring. It could be as simple as that, and that has its complexities as well. But it might be something even more than that. You know, how do we want to make sure that we're keeping our craft labor and everybody else that supports that safe and healthy through the execution phase? Is that going to happen daily? If that happens daily, then, you know, are there productivity impacts because of that? Crew size planning, right? I know a lot of these I know all of you are talking about, because we're working with a number of you on you know, what are these impacts going to be as we progress through our projects. You know, so our crew size is going to be different. You know, if I have to stay within, say, 6 feet of each other, you know, what does that mean for how many resources that I can actually put on the site at any one time? New technologies, are they going to be adopted? You know, we've had the technology of a craft worker wearing a monitor, and, you know, the construction equipment, trucks and things like that, also having a monitor to make sure that we don't, you know, accidentally not see a craft worker, and the trucks can actually slow themselves down and stop in some cases because of that distancing. What we're finding out now is people are starting to consider maybe using that person to person rather than person to equipment, and saying, okay, you know, we'll get an alert if we see that anybody is too close, you know, within that 6 foot radius for an extended period of time. We're going to, you know, basically get some kind of a yellow light, red light type indicator. But if we're going to do that, you know, what's that mean from a adoption standpoint, but also from a productivity standpoint? What are the policies if we believe that somebody tests positive or is above, you know, if you use the temperature reading as an example, if somebody comes through the gate and has a temperature above whatever threshold that we said that was going to be the criteria, what do we do with those individuals, right? I mean, we've got to have a plan to either quarantine them or you know, some other methodology. So that has to be paid for and staffed and so on. Cleaning is going to be an enormous issue. You know, the cleaning of equipment, the cleaning of meeting areas, lunch rooms, things like that. And, you know, what does that mean from a cost and schedule standpoint? The break schedules, right? One of the first things that was really discussed was, you know, lunch rooms and cafeterias. And if we have to stay 6 feet apart, do they even exist in the future, right? Or does somebody just, you know, almost like a food truck type of an environment where you come and get your food and you're off someplace else, versus, you know, putting everybody in a single room, and if they are, then how far apart do they have to be? Or do you have shifts to minimize the amount of you know, resources at any one location at any time? So all of these, and I'll use the last one here as an example, that, you know, we're waiting for states to kind of open up, right? And there may be some states that open up before others, mainly because of how impacted they were on the virus. You know, we're from New Jersey, luckily the southern part of New Jersey, so that seems like the further you got away from the kind of that ground zero of New York City, you know, the less impacted you were. But we basically have to adhere to the, you know, the rules of the state of New Jersey. We're going to open up a lot later than most, just because of, you know, the impact that we had. I know the Texas, Houston, Gulf Coast area right now, you know, you're starting to see some relief. But if everybody opens up in a certain region at a certain time, and everybody starts to go back at a certain time, you know, is that going to cause issues? You know, just from availability of resources, availability of materials, those types of things. So there are some very specific COVID-19 impacts that when you're looking at the construction readiness assessment within the restart mode of today, that we have to address and deal with. So if you look at the process that you would go through in using something like this, you know, as I mentioned before, this just kind of an example of a traditional project, something that's, you know, moderate in size, moderate in complexity, is going to get shut down for potentially maybe, say, 6 months or so. You might do the construction restart readiness assessment, the CRA, today or right now, and you're going in knowing that, you know, your score is probably not going to be that great, right? Because you're still looking 6 months down the line, or maybe 4 months down the line, depending on when you actually shut down. But then you've got to put your plans in place of filling any of those gaps. If you saw some deficiencies in that construction readiness assessment meter, and we're not at that 75 to 85 or 85 and better score, what are those deficiencies? I got to build my prep, my project restart execution plan around what those deficiencies are, and close those deficiencies before I can restart. And that may be one round of this for a smaller type project. But what we're talking about when we take a look at the CRA analysis in these 15 or 16 different categories, and how that correlates to your execution plan, there should be as close as possible a one-to-one correlation. So if you look at here, excuse me, area 5, which is execution factors. Execution factors are in the table of contents of section 5 in your prep, in your project restart execution plan. Now we know that if you're going to use your standard execution plan templates and so on, there may not be a 100% match, 15 sections and 15 sections, but we got to get as close as possible so that that you are closing those open items that are in the readiness assessment with your overall execution plan, right? And when we take a look at a larger project, a larger, more complex type project, you might be doing a CRA number 1, as we said, maybe right now, and looking at those gaps. And then you're preparing the project readiness execution plan. You're taking the corrective actions, and then you're following it up with another CRA. The CRA analysis, they don't take that long, right? I mean, for a smaller type project, it's probably half a day, right? For a large project, it's probably a one-day effort. And the reason for that, it's either yes or no, right? On these questions. It's not like, if you're familiar with the PDRI, and if you've ever gone through a PDRI assessment, there's a lot of dialogue when you're analyzing one of the aspects of the PDRI, and whether it's a 1 or a 5, right? Or anything in between. And every one of those gradients talks about what are the things, especially in the new PDRI Matters tool, you have some definition of what's the difference between a 2, 3, and 4, right? 1 and 5 are easy, but 2, 3, and 4 are kind of tough. In this tool, it's a little more simple because it's either yes or no. And if there's any deficiency in any of those, any of the items that support a criteria or a factor, then it's a no, right? But then what you're doing is you're identifying why it's a no, right? So again, if I have that schedule and the schedule's critical path, I put together the schedule, but I have not resource loaded it yet, then the answer is a no. And then what you're doing as part of this execution, the project restart execution plan, is you're pulling out that. Yes.
I was just going to add, it's fascinating to think about, if you go back to the research, the fact that approximately half of the research projects that were studied to put this tool together were judged by their own teams, in retrospect, to have not been construction ready. So it gives you a feel for just how much good you can do with something like this. If you do like the chart you have in front of you, where you're repeatedly looking at, identifying problems and fixing them, there's a lot of room for improvement, because we admit to ourselves when we do something like this that we have items that we're not complete on that we should be complete on.
Yeah, and the value obviously is in developing or updating that execution strategy and then implementing that execution strategy. The CRA allows us to understand what those gaps are, but those CRA efforts are very efficient. As I said before, even on a complex project like we're looking at here, each one of these CRA initiatives might only be a day, right? So there's not a big commitment to it, as long as it's done honestly. And as Jimmy said, that if you really do believe you have a deficiency, the answer is no on that particular criteria. But then you work the plan to close that gap. And then the repetitive nature of how many times you go and iterate this has to do with a couple of things, right? One is the size and complexity of the project, obviously, but it's also how long you're slowing down for, right? So, an example might be that if you've got a 6-month slowdown, that you're doing one now, you're probably doing a CRA in about 3 months, or kind of use a T-minus clock of -3 months from your plan to restart to see how far you've progressed all the planning activities. And then you do one right before you start to mobilize, several weeks before you mobilize, so catch any of those last, outlier type issues that you have to close before you go into the restart mode. So I'm gonna stop there, and we went through that relatively quickly, and leave the last roughly 15 minutes or so of the session for any questions that you might have, or any comments where people have actually applied the CRA tool to a restart. And Jimmy and I'll be happy to address any questions you might have. I don't know, Mike, if you've got anything that's been submitted so far?
Yes, we do.
Excellent.
One question is, who should participate in the CRA?
Yeah, so it's a great question, right? So, I mean, it's similar to the PDRI, that you typically need somebody to facilitate it, right? Somebody to ask the questions and drive to the yes or no, right? So if you find any deficiency, that it's driving you to the no. But then you take a look at the project planning team, or the execution planning team, right? So you're going to need somebody from engineering, because you may still have some engineering deficiencies. Obviously, procurement. You've got construction representatives. So if you take I'm going to go back here and use this diagram, right? Sorry for this. Getting to the big diagram so everybody can see it, right? So if you look at the representatives that would lead any of these actors, so you need somebody from the business to basically say, have the business parameters changed at all. You might even have somebody from contracts, right? If you're either going out to a different contractor, or adjusting the contract using the same contractor that was selected previously. So it's really a representative for any of the areas that are identified here. It's not 15 people, because obviously stakeholder management kind of covers everybody. It's probably about 10 to 12 resources.
Thanks. There's another related question. Says, does the CRA tool assess the readiness of supply chain for construction?
So
you
if
see
you
number
look at,
13, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, is that the, yeah, oh yeah, right. So it is, area 15. So there are, 14 factors that are related to that. And what it will address, and again, this is where you'd have to kind of shift your lens a little bit, right? Is you may have had, all of the procured items kind of in place. You looked at long lead requirements, you looked at delivery estimates, and so on, when you started the project at the beginning. Now we get into this, and let's use the COVID-19 case as an example. We got to reevaluate that, because it's not just my project that's getting influenced. It's also the suppliers and so on that are getting influenced by COVID-19. So right now we're working on a project up in Canada. They're getting ready and actually just started construction, and their philosophy, or their assessment, is that things are looking very good. They have not been impacted that negatively on their overall execution environment, but they have not yet seen whether procurement is going to get impacted. They're buying things from the United States. So, the questions that you would ask prior to this would be, okay, are there going to be, as a result of COVID-19, are there going to be any issues of bringing, supplies, materials across? If it's a domestic U.S. project, U.S. state lines. If it's an international project, it would be country boundaries. And whether that's customs issues or anything like that, or just shutdowns of borders. And So I think a long-winded answer would be yes, but you've got to ask the question within that lens again of the COVID-19 impact.
Yeah, and I think there's an endless number of examples, Steve, of how that lens works. I mean, there are questions that deal with, do you have a good factory acceptance test program in place? Well, yeah, you do. You had it, everything was working fine. Well, now that particular manufacturing facility is shut down. So you don't have a good factory acceptance test program. You don't even have an open factory. So that lens that you apply to the specific questions is very important. There's nothing wrong with using them the way they are. You just have to understand the lens and how you have to interpret them.
And I think that's where that independent facilitator comes in, is important. And again, it doesn't have to be, although Pathfinder does these types of things, it doesn't have to be somebody like us, somebody independent from the project team that understands the tool, that can challenge the team and whether they've really thought through it within that lens again, within this shutdown mode of the world shutdown in this case, and how those tangential things might affect you, like whether that factory is still operating as normal, and would you get that factory acceptance test done? Hopefully that answers that question.
Yeah, great. There were a couple questions about who should facilitate it, so that's good. You hit that one too. In a previous review of the CRA tool, it was asked to compare and contrast with PDRI feed matters. Can you speak on the strengths and weaknesses of these tools in comparison to one another, and which tool really gives you the most bang for the buck pre-FID? This is from Jamie Marzoni, an owner.
That one hits home because I sat on the Feed Matters research team. So Jimmy and I can battle over this. But so if you take a look at if you are in pre-authorization from an owner standpoint, pre-authorization, I'll use FEL phases, right? So FEL1, FEL2, FEL3. The Feed Matters tool and the matters part of it, right? The accuracy part, which talks about the quality of the deliverables. That was the new feature that was put into the Feed Matters tool. That still applies because it talks about whether the teams worked together in the past, whether the team's got the right level of information, do they have enough time to do their work, so on and so forth. There's 27 questions that kind of sets the environment of whether that effort can be done efficiently and effectively. Doesn't mean that you're going to get a perfect quality coming out of it, but it does situate yourself. In a restart mode, those same things would occur, and probably even more critical, right? Because now we're, hopefully we're taking the time to do all those typical things that were done in your pre-authorization well. I think the two tools work together, marvelously, right? Because one is focused on the overall planning aspects, your engineering aspects, a lot of the things that support a plus or minus 10% estimate, and an equal level of quality on your schedule. And that's the PDRI matters. We used to call it Feed Matters. It's PDRI matters now. This tool, if used early enough, at least sets the tone for what needs to be in that construction plan. And then as you use it the way that it was talked about here, as it in stages, right, where you can see the graph get more improved as you move along. You use it, first of all, as kind of a checklist of the things that you should do, and you're going to have probably a pretty poor score, right, up in the early phase, because you still need a lot of work to be done in the details before you hit construction. But then as you go through detailed engineering and you apply this tool, you're refining that construction program or that construction environment to be much more efficient. And I just, I think you're progressing your PDRI to the end of FEL3 from basically starting it in FEL2 and maybe doing 2 or 3 assessments to the end of FEL3. And you're starting your construction readiness as early as FEL3, but then using it in detailed engineering right before you hit construction. So I think they work very well together. Jimmy, I don't know if you've got any.
Yeah, the only thing I would add is, and certainly I think they both are necessary and both are very useful. I would would advise, though, to not overplay in our minds the amount of effort required to do the construction readiness assessment, because you could literally do it monthly if you wanted to without it being a horrible expense or horrible. It's really little more than a well-written checklist to see exactly where you stand. In the early stages of the project and the PDRI, you can get pretty intense, and it's necessary. It's good to understand exactly what the status of the engineering is and what has to be done, and rolling drawings out on the table and studying them and figuring all that out. This is not that difficult when you get to the construction readiness stage, in my mind.
Yeah, I think, as I said before, I think the difficult part is once you've identified that you have those gaps, is taking a look at that action item list and getting those things done, right? Is closing those gaps. So the next assessment reads that much better, and then hopefully you're in pretty good shape when you're ready to hit the field. Hopefully that answers the question.
Yeah, a related question. Can you estimate how many hours it takes to work through the CRA tool?
Yeah, I think I mentioned it a little earlier, but obviously a lot of it depends on the complexity of the project. But we've done, I'll call them more, smaller to routine types of projects, and we've done a CRA in half a day, right? 3 to 4 hours. Your larger types of projects, a little more complexity to them, bigger dollar spend, you're probably spending a day. We're planning one right now that's probably a day, but we're going to do it virtually, so we're splitting it over 2 days for a large multi-billion-dollar type project. So it varies depending on the complexity of the project.
Now, it's important to remember that part of that time you're spending is planning the gap closures. So if you were just simply answering 228 yes/no questions, you could probably certainly finish in half a day, maybe even a little shorter than that. But while you're doing it, and you've got the people together, there of course is benefit to mapping out what the corrective actions are and getting them on paper and getting them recorded, so that the next time you look at the tool, you know what it is you should have done or had to do.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, these things don't usually take care of themselves. 3
reviews in a row and have to recreate it every time you ask it. You want to get some of it recorded so you know what the story is.
Yeah, exactly. Andrew Foy asks, are you seeing owners stipulate the use of this tool on projects to prove readiness to start construction?
Not that we've seen it. So what we're seeing is that it's starting to show up in a lot more of the, I'll call them their project delivery processes, where, if you look at the stage gate approach, you'd see a PDRI or an independent review right before the end of a gate. We are starting to see it show up in the execution details, that you will do a construction readiness assessment. Has it been mandated yet? We're not seeing, I mean, the tool's only been out for maybe a year and a half, 2 years, I guess. So we haven't seen that it's absolutely mandatory yet. But when we start to develop classification systems for our owners, something like this on a pump replacement type project might not warrant itself. But as you start to go from a simple project to more of a routine project to a complex project, and that routine to complex, it's trending now to be a requirement.
Great. At the time of the implementation of the tool and its assumed continued development, what were some of the early on recognized shortcomings, and how did that help to improve the tool? So when it's being beta tested, so to speak.
Right. Jimmy, maybe I'll hand that one off to you, since you were part of the first couple of.
Yeah, I think as I remember, one of the things that happened was, as we studied the performance associated with each project, and we judged projects to be successful, we judged them to be failures. After a little bit of frustration and a little bit of head scratching, we came to the realization that there are certainly factors. It's not an absolute. You can say, did you have IFC drawings ready and everybody had them and there were no holes on them and all that. You say, nope, didn't have that. But the project was successful. So we spent a lot of time taking those anomalies and finally quantified them and decided it wasn't much of a factor. So it was part of what drug it out. There was a lot of pushback from people who, when they did the initial assessments, they said, well, you've got a lot of questions here that these shards heck aren't all related to restart. And we did some analysis to say, should we trim that back? But I think the eventual consensus was that while some of them you can say they're construction readiness, or you can say they're a well-organized, well-run project. So there can't be anything wrong with doing that, right? So if the specific, question number 187 may not jump out at you as being specifically construction readiness related, but it does jump out at you as being a well-run project. So in the end, we did not have a lot of rework or a lot of corrections, and I think
one of the things that all these research efforts eventually realize is that you'll see trends, and some of the trends, some of the deficiencies can be overcome by people that have very I'll call it a very skilled and experienced project team can overcome some deficiencies in the planning process. And what we're saying is there's less and less of those types of teams available anymore. So we need to rejuvenate that experience level and rely on more data and history and so on than somebody just intuitively knowing it, because we just don't have that experience across all of our teams. So in creating, whether it's the PDRI matters or even the construction readiness assessment, trying to develop those series of questions that if they're answered correctly, can really guide you to an environment of higher potential success. None of this is etched in stone, right? I mean, you could have a great score here and still have a bad project, right? If your team doesn't follow through.
And lastly, I would give a great shout out to the academic team that was involved here, because a lot of what seemed to not be working at the end was worked out and corrected in the analytical pieces of the tool. They were able to solve the problems and make it work to where we all became convinced that this is a good quality set of questions that answers the question of readiness correctly.
Yeah, I also got to give a shout out to the whole process that CII went through. This was one of those first research efforts that we wanted to get done in a shorter period of time. Traditionally, CII would take 3 years to go through the academic part of it, get the document drafted, and then actually roll it out. Was a 3-year process. And what the industry and CII members realized is, the way that the industry changes, in our industry perspective slide earlier, if you wait 3 years for something to come out, it may be past the point in time where it adds value. So this was one of the first tools to actually be developed within a 6-month to 1 year time frame. And I can remember the planning process of talking about a yes/no type of answer rather than kind of the gradient scale of a PDRI. And to see it come to fruition and then the successes that a lot of companies have had, I think is a real testament to the CII vision to be able to do these things quickly.
Okay, thank you both very much. That's all the time we have for today. We'd like to thank all of the attendees for joining us today. We appreciate your time, and we hope you enjoyed the webinar. Don't forget to check out our events page to sign up for future webinars. You can find that off of our homepage, www.construction-institute.org. Stay safe, and we'll see you next time.
Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone. Thank you for your attendance.